My name is Shari, Bryan. I'm the Vice President for NDI, the National Democratic Institute, and I'll be moderating this event. I first want to thank New York University for partnering with us on this event, and also the One Sky Giving Circle for their generous donation to support our guest testimonial speaker, who you'll hear from in a few minutes, Farida Bemba from Togo. Tonight we'll introduce you to the many issues related to violence against women in politics around the world, and present you to several of the tools that NDI has been working on to bring an end to this violence. There's also going to be a Q&A at the end of the evening's event, and we've asked a few people in the audience to test the new safety planning tool. I don't know who you are, but you may have tablets in your lap. And we'll be presenting the results of your self-assessment later in the evening. The event is being live streamed, so please tweet at NDI and at NDI Women to help us spread the word about the tools. We also find that Twitter handles of our guest speakers in the program, so feel free to use those as well. Now, it's my very important honor, best honor, to introduce NDI's chairman, Madeleine K. Albright. Chairman Albright was the 64th U.S. Secretary of the United States and became at that time the highest ranking woman in the history of the United States government. As Secretary of State, Dr. Albright reinforced America's alliances, advocated for democracy and human rights, and promoted America trade, business and labor, and environmental standards worldwide. She does many things. We are honored to have her as chair of NDI, but of the many other things she does, she is a prolific author and has written a number of important books. The most recent one is a must-read for all of you. It's titled Fascism, A Warning. She did not pay me to tell you this, but I read it and I encourage you all to get it and read it soon. Secretary Albright has been a champion on this campaign to stop violence against women. She has spoken out about this issue on numerous occasions, both here in Washington and around the world, and we're delighted to have her leadership to amplify the work we're doing around the world. Please help me in giving a warm welcome now to Honorable Secretary Madeleine Albright.
Thank you very much, Shari, and good evening to all of you. Thank you all for being here. On behalf of the National Democratic Institute, I'd like to also express my thanks to New York University's DC Center for hosting this event. I also want to express my gratitude to NDI's Gender, Women, and Democracy team, led by Sandra Pepera, for their incredible work on the issue that brings us together this evening, safeguarding women in politics. Now, I've been associated with NDI for nearly 35 years, and one thing that I've learned is that when democratic movements of any type arise, they inspire and liberate, but they also generate opposition from those who have power and refuse to share it. This opposition takes many forms, but violence is one of them. In Honduras, in early 2016, the environmental activist Berta Caceres was gunned down because she threatened to derail a controversial dam project. In June of the same year, British parliamentarian Jo Cox was shot and stabbed to death because of her support for the European Union and legal immigration. The man who killed her called her a, and I quote, traitor to white people. The following month in Burundi, Hafsa Mossi, a member of the East African Legislative Assembly, was assassinated. We don't know why, we don't know by whom, but we do know that a courageous voice on behalf of peace was forever stilled. Earlier this year, City Councilor Muriel Franco was murdered when assailants in Rio de Janeiro raked her car with bullets. Muriel had been a longtime critic of police brutality. The bullets were from a batch bought previously by the federal police. These and other prominent crimes have attracted a lot of attention, but the majority of violence towards women in politics takes place far from the public eye, behind closed doors, in the forms of assaults and threats and vicious comments, both direct and through the social media. Often, these attempts to intimidate are grounded in political differences, but frequently they emanate from party colleagues as well, from men who agree on ideology but don't like having to share the spotlight with women. In the book I recently wrote, that Shari publicized so much, called Fascism, I note that authoritarianism comes in a variety of shapes. There is no one model, but there are certain common characteristics. And one is the need that all tyrants have to exercise control and bend others to their will. To that end, they propagate the myth that those who oppose them are less than human, that they are not equal in dignity and worth because of what they think or where they come from or the language they speak or the color of their skin or their sexual orientation or gender. This propaganda is reinforced by words that dismiss and demean, by physical cruelty aimed at generating submission, and by policies designed to prop up the strong and hold the disadvantaged down. Adolf Hitler promised to women was emancipation from emancipation. In the Third Reich, he said, women would not have to worry about the burden of being free. More recently, the president of the Philippines suggested that female rebels should be sexually assaulted or shot in the vagina. Earlier, he joked about a woman who had been gang raped, then murdered, saying, and I quote him, "I should have been the first in line." In too many countries today, including Hungary, Venezuela, and Turkey, authoritarian leaders have grabbed the pendulum of history and swung it into reverse. Women are among the principal targets when civil society is repressed, journalists are thrown in jail, judicial systems lose their independence, and elections are drained of their meaning, because that is when the voices of change are drowned out and the status quo, controlled by the fraternal order of despots, is reaffirmed. Here in the United States, those of us who followed the 2016 presidential campaign don't have to dig very deep into our memories to recall the 6 signs, slogans, and sneers. As for Russia, I wish someone would remind Vladimir Putin of his rightful place in history. After all, his first name isn't Catherine, and his last name isn't Great. As I said, there are many models of tyranny, from outright fascism to what some have labeled illiberal democracy. But dictators of all stripes count on good people failing to act as they should, either because they're confused, divided, or afraid. Democracy, however, depends on people who have the courage to speak up, join together, and fight back against injustice. It depends on people who refuse to be intimidated or to bury their ideals, people who insist on the truth. And that's why NDI launched its Not the Cost campaign more than 2 years ago, to ensure that women everywhere have a fair chance to participate in the political life of their countries. With that purpose in mind, we are employing every tool at our disposal, from the use of focus groups to connections made through social media, to the design of election observer missions, to the drafting of model laws, to the mobilization of public opinion around the equator and from pole to pole. This is an incredibly complicated and challenging issue, but I'm very proud to say that we are making progress. We achieved an important milestone earlier this month when the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Dubravka Simonovic, presented the first ever report on this issue to the UN General Assembly. We at NDI were pleased that many member states are already responding to her call for victims to be encouraged to speak up and perpetrators to be held accountable. Tonight marks another very important moment in our campaign, with the launch of a new safety planning tool and the first ever Women's Political Participation Risk Index. This safety planning tool, called Think 10, grew out of our conversations with female political activists around the world. By and large, these women are aware of the risks of engaging in politics and worried about the prospect of violence. But while some are discouraged from participating, the vast majority want to know what they can do to stem some of those risks. So what Think 10 will provide is a way for women to take informed steps to enhance their safety. We cannot reduce the risk to zero, but we can empower women to take back some control. NDI's Women's Political Risk Participation Index will also help in this effort. For the first time, it's going to provide a baseline to measure each country's progress on this issue, and it will call attention to a problem that has been swept under the rug for far too long. We are fortunate to live in an era when the world is beginning to wake up to the challenge of gender-based violence. And just a few weeks ago, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Dr. Denis Mukwege, a Congolese gynecologist who has treated thousands of rape victims, and Nadia Murad, a Yazidi woman who was held as a sex slave by ISIS. It's so important to lift up the courageous voices who are on the front lines of this battle, and that is why I'm delighted that we will be hearing shortly from another very brave young woman, Farida Bemba Nabourema. We recognize in all that we do what we can. Women alone, like a man alone, can be made to feel fear. But when women are united, no one can push us around. So let me be clear. For women, violence is not a rightful or inevitable cost of participation in politics. Participation in politics is the way we will end violence against women. I want to leave you with one request, which I hope you will share with women and friends of women everywhere. Whether you wear a ceremonial dress or a pantsuit or a hijab or a sari, whether you're standing on a dirt floor or bumping up against a glass ceiling, help to make our voices heard in the voting booth, in legislative bodies at all levels, in multilateral organizations, in the courts, in the media, in civil society, in the workplace. Make our voices heard in 100 different languages wherever questions of freedom and dignity and human rights are at issue. If you attack one of us, you attack all of us. But if you stand with us, we can and we will make the world freer, more peaceful, and more just than it ever has been. It took me a long time to find my voice. Now that I have it, I am not going to shut up. So thank you very, very much for your attention tonight. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary Albright. I would now like to welcome and introduce a very brave woman, Farida Bemba Nabourema. Farida is currently the executive director of the Togolese Civil League, and as a result of her advocacy and activism for political reform in Togo, she has faced multiple types of violence against herself and against her family. In 2014, she published a book titled The Pressure of Oppression, in which she discusses the different forms of oppression that people face throughout Africa and highlights the need for youth and women to be politically engaged. Her story is an example of the courage that many women have to exhibit to be able to advocate for what they believe in. Farida, thank you for being with us this evening. Please join us and tell us your story.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Farida Nabourema. Where I come from, the word politics in itself is very scary. I was born and raised in Togo. It is a country of 8 million people located in West Africa. And for the past 51 years, my country has been ruled by the same family, the Nyasimbe. The father was in power for 38 years, and the son took over and ruled the country ever since he died in 2005. In Togo, if you are against the government, regardless of your gender, of course, your life is at risk. I grew up in a country where I heard the stories of people like that of my dad who went through severe human rights abuses and violations. They will be arrested, tortured to death. Some people will be dumped in the sea. Some, like my dad, will have electric cord wrapped around their genitalia and tortured. And when it comes to women, it is even worse. I would like to share the story of 3 particular women. One of them, back in the 90s, was the wife of an activist. Her husband was in exile, like I am myself today. And the government, calling for the husband to return, to turn himself in, arrested her one night. They wrapped electric cord on her breast and tortured her. They did not allow her to attend to her baby that they left in the house, and the baby that was 3 weeks old died. There was another woman who was a very prominent Togolese scholar and historian. She was invited at the national radio and criticized the government during the interview. By the time she was done, soldiers were waiting for her outside the radio station. They raped her in group inside the compound of the national radio station. Till date, she never recovered. Then there is another woman whose story I'm about to tell, and that woman is myself. I got involved in politics at a pretty relatively young age as a teenager because my father, an activist himself, was arrested when I was 13 years old. But when I became more popular in Togo was in 2011 when I founded the Four Must Go movement because I couldn't stand the idea that Fonya Simbe, who got over 500 of my countrymen killed to take power when my father died, will remain president for life like his own dad. Supporters of the government soon enough recorded a video and posted it on YouTube calling for my execution and that of my family. That video is still on today. And in the video, they said, when we will come to your house, we'll make sure everybody dies, including the dog. And if Oyademanya Simbe were not so merciful to your father, he would have made sure he had killed all of you, and you wouldn't have the guts today to come out and challenge his son. Of course, that video was just one of the multiple threats I and my family received because I called for the people to sign a petition demanding Fonya Simbe to step down. At some point, it got so overwhelming for my family members that they gave me an ultimatum. It's either I chose between politics or I separate myself from them. I moved out from my family house. Until today, I still do not have close contact with my siblings for that reason. The threats they received, them and the members of my family, were very difficult for them to overcome. And excluding my dad, who himself has been an activist his whole life, almost all of them believed that I, being an activist, was a very selfish decision that was putting their life at risk. And I can understand that because in Togo, so many activists have been killed and are continuing to face the full wrath of the Togolese militaries. Last year, after so many years of advocacy in the Four Must Go movement, in the aftermath of a political protest in which many of our countrymen got killed, I called for people to step out on the streets and demand once again the end of dictatorship and the departure of Fonya Simbe. I became the face of the Four Must Go movement. Hundreds of thousands of our countrymen responded to our call and that of political parties. And for several weeks, we'll go on having protests in Togo, the biggest in our country's history. And at some point, we were able to have over 1 million people in the streets. But that was the moment where violence and threats against me heightened. The government shut down the internet, but I was able to get information out and spread information on social media. And I became the main source of information for Togolese activists and Togolese people who were following Togo's news on Twitter and Facebook and other social media platforms. The government set up websites. On some of them, I was an escort girl. Others, I was a prostitute. Others, I was a drug dealer. Well, I was surprised that for 51 years, they were unable to create jobs for about 45% of our youth, but within weeks, they managed to create multiple ones for myself. It wasn't that difficult for me because I was used to receiving so many threats and so many insults and smearings and attacks. But one day, a lady wrote to me, and she was disturbed by the content she has been saying, the cropped images of my social media pictures on naked women, and they started circulating them as me. And the lady was feeling so sorry for me, and she said, "This is why I will never allow my daughter to get involved in politics." Her reaction brought mixed feelings. I was outraged. I was outraged that other girls may have to go through what I have been through to earn a space in the political arena, because I myself have faced a lot of pressure and intimidation coming from my mom, who at some point told me that if she had known that I will grow up to become as stubborn like my dad and as politically involved like my dad, she would have never allowed me to leave Togo. Because leaving Togo gave me the space and the ability to advocate against the government and become an activist. And my mom was for a very long time troubled that I was Farida Nabourema, the most politically active girl in Togo, and what the people of Togo usually refer to as the WhatsApp girl. 3 weeks ago, actually, there was a video that went viral again in the Togolese community. A young girl was raped, and turned out that she and I share the same name. Even though clearly from the video, the victim and I don't look alike, many of the people who for a long time hated me for being an activist were rejoicing. I actually received messages of people telling me that this is what I deserve. And they are grateful for my rapists, because a girl that has the guts to threaten the government is a girl that is not domesticated. That's the word they used. Well, I'm glad I am not a dog or a cat, but that also reminded me that the days of violence against women in politics in Togo are far from being over. And I, being a woman and having a voice, is a threat to many people who believe that I don't deserve to have a say in the way my country is governed, not on the basis of me being a citizen, but on the simple basis of me being a woman to start with. When NDI invited me to attend the launch of the very first UN report on violence against women in politics at the United Nations 2 weeks ago, it was my first time actually going to the UN to not protest. I was like, for the first time, the UN is doing something, and I will clap. Well, I did, and I rejoiced, because the initiative that the NDI, Dr. Albright, Sandra took to denounce the abuse that women like myself face in politics is going to give more opportunity for women like myself to get involved. As a girl, I had to earn the respect of my peers by taking on the riskiest missions sometimes in Togo, just so I could prove a point that I too, as a girl, am worthy of being listened to and can be a leader. For so long, I and other women like myself were told that we had to endure abuse if we want to be in position of power or have a say in the way our country is run. But I say that no, we do not have to be humiliated, abused, or dehumanized to have a voice or to be a leader. Violence is not the cause for women in politics. And to those who sell violence to us women who want to be in politics, I ask you to find your clients, because I will not take it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Farida, for sharing your story and for your bravery. You are an inspiration to all of us here tonight and an inspiration to women around the world. I'd now like to introduce my colleague and friend, Sandra Pepera, who is NDI's Director for Gender, Women, and Democracy. And she's going to talk to us more about the Think 10 safety planning tool. But I just first want to say a few words about Sandra. She and her team at NDI thought long and hard about what the barriers are to getting more women into elected office around the world. And after years of training women and encouraging them and helping them campaign and understand the nuts and bolts of politics, she and her team decided that that was not enough, that we had to look at other things that were preventing women from getting into office. And violence was the one issue that no one had really been talking about. And over the last 2 years, she and her team did a lot of research, met with a lot of different people, and began talking to women who are in politics and out of politics. And you know, you talk to one person and then you realize there's 10 other women just like her who have the same story. And over the last 2 years, Sandra and her team have really turned this effort into a global movement, that violence is not the cost of getting involved in politics. And as the secretary and Farida said, this is now an issue at the United Nations, which is quite remarkable. It's something that we're very proud of, that the UN is now reporting on violence against women as part of its reporting on violence against, reporting women in politics as a component of reporting on violence against women. I take my hat off to Sandra and her team and now turn it over to her to give you more details about this tool. Sandra?
Thanks very much, Shari, and thank you all for coming this evening. It's a great pleasure to be here, and every time I sort of speak to Farida, I just kind of, it's hard. She's a very young woman. She's not 30 yet, and she has lived a life, I think, that most of us won't have lived sort of 30 years from now. So it's with great honor and humility that I stand on the same platform as she does. So we love Madeleine. And she gives us some of our very best lines. And this is another one. Development without democracy is improbable. Democracy without women is impossible. So at NDI, as Shari told you, we work to help women overcome the barriers to their equal and active political participation. Why? Yes, because it's their human right to do so. And because politics, democratic politics, that's what we believe in, is still the least worst way to ensure that the competition for power, the allocation of resources, and the provision of services, including security, are managed with inclusion, participation, transparency, and accountability. For the avoidance of doubt, at NDI, we believe all violence against women is bad and must stop. But because we are in the democratic consolidation business, we see violence against women in politics as having three key characteristics. It's a human rights abuse, always. It constrains women's civil and political rights, and it undermines democratic integrity. Oops, sorry, I think I've gone too far. Opposition to women's political participation is rooted in unequal gender relations. It seems to know no boundaries as far as geography, culture, class, religion, or level of development is concerned. It traverses the private and the public space, and I think Madeleine made that point earlier on. And we know that violence can be experienced by men in politics too. However, the violence that women face is rooted in unequal gender relations. It targets women because they are women. It is gendered in its form, more often about sex or working with sexual tropes. And its impact is to deter all women from engaging. The messages don't come out here. And I think it's really instructive to understand the difference between political violence and violence against women in politics. In Uganda, in 2016, the opposition party went out on a rally. And there was one woman in the leadership of the opposition party. And as is the way, unfortunately, in Uganda, the police authorities came out and basically roughed them all up. And, you know, that's political violence. That is unfortunately what happens in Uganda. But at the point at which the sole woman in the leadership was taken aside and stripped naked in public, now you're doing something else. This is what we talk about when we're talking about violence against politically active women. It targeted the woman, it was gendered in its form, and it sent a very clear message to other women: don't come out here. If you are young, marginalized, or geographically isolated, Global Witness says 1,500 environmental activists get killed each year. if you're in a community where socio-cultural norms reinforce notions of a woman's place or overlay these with morality, certain attacks can have an impact far beyond your political ambition. And our political institutions have also done a very poor job of protecting women. At their best, political parties are the preeminent political institution for mobilizing citizens behind a policy platform, for selecting candidates, forming a government, or acting as a loyal opposition. But they're also what we've called protected public spaces. Because as with legislatures and council chambers, until very recently, what has gone on within these structures, with impunity, have been criminal offenses outside those structures in the same jurisdiction. The internet is an area where an old problem, the shaming and humiliating and terrorizing of women, has been given a new and more toxic life. And some of you may have picked up the news this morning from the UK, where even Theresa May is being vilely abused online with actually some fairly serious threats. Jo Cox, whom Secretary Albright mentioned earlier on, she'd been stalked online by the man who eventually killed her. This business about the gateway effect and how violence jumps off the online world into the physical reality is something that we should all pay a lot more attention to. And we need to be careful about suggesting a gap between the online and the physical worlds. One level of controlling behavior can escalate. And similarly, where controlling behavior can have a physical manifestation. What have we been doing? A lot. We felt there was a gap, and we felt that it was important to focus on the very different aspects of the political arena where NDI is active. So we do electoral observation. So we thought, let's focus on votes without violence. How do we support women to be engaged in elections without violence? We work with parties to strengthen their internal processes. So we've done some work to develop new assessment mechanisms, the No Party to Violence assessment tool. And obviously, online disinformation is the big new issue. And it's an important one because it's where so many young women are going to be. This is their mode of communication. This is their realm of activity. And when they get pushed out of that space and they get pushed out of politics, it has a knock-on effect. So we've been doing a project on Twitter speech and finding out how and when young women fall out of political conversations on Twitter. But we felt literally the last area that we wanted to focus on was, what do you do for the individual woman? The individual woman who is just starting out and just thinking whether or not she's going to join a party or she's going to go into parliament. She's just stepping out into the world. And we felt a lot of women were going out there with really no idea of the risks or how to mitigate some of those risks. So we came up with this idea about this, the Think 10 safety planning tool. And we started really and based it on the work that gets done in the intimate partner violence and the domestic violence arena around, in their terms, lethality assessments. Our safety planning tool has 3 steps. Each politically active woman or somebody who's thinking about going into politics takes a questionnaire about who she is, how active she is in politics, and where she lives, the country in which she does her politics. From this, she'll get a personal score. We then have ranked 172 countries for the risk of women participating in politics. And we've done this looking at the number of women who are formally in the political sphere, at the state of democracy as adjudged by, in this instance, the Economist Intelligence Unit, and thirdly, at the level of violence that is prevalent towards women in that community. Taken together, it will indicate which level of safety planning you should think about. And depending on your level of risk, we've provided some safety planning guidance. As Secretary Albright said, we can't mitigate every risk to zero, but we think that, this is just a screenshot of the tool, we think that we can help women increase their safety and security as they move around. We drew on expertise, as I said, from politics and from many other areas, and Think 10 really talks about 10 areas for action. And we thought long and hard, and we talked to lots of people, including some of the people in this room, and we decided that there were 10 areas of action that probably every single woman in politics should focus on. And these are the 10. So develop trusted contacts, safe places, personal information, important documents, your surroundings, traveling, your digital footprint, support services, document, and your safety plan. And what we've done is develop guidance about how you might take action in each of these areas. Depending on your level of risk, you may have to take more or deeper levels of action. So, for example, if you are indicated that you're at a moderate level of risk, your trusted contacts, the guidance is as you see it on the left-hand side of the screen. So identify 1 to 2 trusted, reliable people or organizations that you could contact for support in different situations. Memorize their contact details so that you can reach them at any time. If you can't memorize the details, find a way to disguise them in your phone, address book, or something that is always with you. On the right-hand side, you'll see it's still trusted contacts guidance, but we're asking people to do more or differently because now you're in a different risk environment. So, yes, identify 1 to 2 people or organizations that you could contact for support in different situations, both inside and outside the country. Memorize their contact details so you can reach them at any time. Do not be writing them down anywhere. Do not be keeping them in any place. Establish regular, at least weekly, safe and secure check-in mechanisms with these contacts, and so on. So as the level of risk elevates, we ask you to do different and deeper things. Similarly, with your surroundings, at a moderate level, we'd say always assess your surroundings when carrying out political activities. Check for the exits. Review the physical security of your home, workplace, or political location, and so on. If you were somebody at the severe level of risk, the safety planning guidance would suggest maybe you should consider undergoing some security training yourself and having some level of trained security support available to you. Always have a security check of a location for your political engagement. And you may need to seek enhanced security advice. So again, the guidance and the advice deepens the more risky the environment is for the woman who's taken the tool. So in a way, this is the story so far, and you're going to hear more from my colleague Geoff Hughes about the actual risk index. I came across this reference from that bastion of feminist writing, The Economist, when I was trying to think of something new to say. You can imagine we've all on my team been on a tour on this for a while, and you're always trying to come up with a new angle to it, really. But this isn't a new angle. What we found is that the work we've been doing is a contribution to one part of the re-energizing of a global movement for women's rights, in which addressing gender-based violence of all kinds is the central theme. So if you swapped out Me Too, hashtag there, and put in hashtag not the cost, the meaning would be exactly the same. The Not the Cost campaign is not so much about sex, it is about power. And it is the power that people hold in the political environment and the power that people do not wish to share. In this instance, not wish to share with women. It's about how power is distributed and how people are held accountable when power is abused. That's at the heart of the Not the Cost campaign. And as Farida said, it can't be that women simply exercising their rights and actually working to make inequalities of all kinds less unequal should be faced with violence. That cannot be the way forward. And that's why we've said it's not the cost of women's political participation. That's it from me for now, but I think we'll be back for questions and answers later on. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sandra. I should let you all know that this tool has been under wraps throughout its development. So we are really excited to be walked through this for the first time. And I'm amazed at how practical and functional it is that I was just sitting there thinking that this, you don't even have to be thinking about going into politics. I think we should all, everyone in this room, should use the Think 10 and walk through it tonight or tomorrow. This and the other tools that Sandra talked about and showed you on the screen are available on NDI's website, www.ndi.org. Make sure that there should be some cards or work cards in your chairs, little Think 10 prompt cards. Take those home with you and give them to any women activists or any friend that you know that could be interested. It's now my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Krook, who is a professor of political science and chair of the Women in Politics PhD program at Rutgers University, and is currently an Andrew Carnegie Fellow researching and writing an academic book on violence against women in politics, this very topic. Dr. Krook has collaborated with NDI on its Not the Cost campaign since 2015. We're delighted to have her here with us, and I just want it for all of you who are students or who are interested in this topic, look her up, read what she's written about. She has some phenomenal research, and we're really excited that she's here tonight to present her current views on women in politics in the United States. So welcome, Lena.
Thanks so much. So my presentation, as Shari mentioned, is going to try to bring these questions to the context of the United States. Oops, sorry. So as you've already heard, we've seen rising global attention to the problem of violence against women in politics, which has shown that, like violence against women more generally, this is a problem that affects women in all countries. But recognition of the problem varies across contexts, with debates in Latin America being perhaps the most advanced in terms of understanding the problem and seeking to advance solutions to combat it. Oops, sorry, this is, all right. So in the US context, the examples that perhaps we're all most familiar with are those involving Donald Trump, who during the last presidential elections called on the Second Amendment people to do something about his rival, Hillary Clinton. And nearly a year after the election, he retweeted a video of himself hitting her with a golf ball. Sorry. But the use of violent language and imagery is not, of course, limited to Donald Trump. Over the last several years, we've seen members of both major parties engage in threatening behaviors targeting their own party colleagues. During the 2016 primary season, for example, supporters of Bernie Sanders targeted the Nevada State Democratic Chair, Roberta Lang, with threatening phone calls, emails, and text messages, which one reporter described as haunting and personal. Loved how you broke the system, one person wrote in a text message that he said he or she knew where Ms. Lang's grandchildren went to school. Prepare for hell, calls won't stop. Another person left a voicemail message saying he thought Ms. Lang should be hung in public execution for her actions. And then she responded in the story, I'm scared for my family, scared for my kids. Similarly, on several occasions over the past year, Republican men in the House of Representatives have threatened their own female colleagues when they haven't supported their policy initiatives. So in this tweet from reporter Chris Hayes, he says, in the last 3 days, Republican men in the House have threatened their female Senate colleagues with shooting and beating. This is a problem, therefore, that's not limited to a single person or to a single party. We've also seen recent news stories showing this is not simply a problem at the national level, but also at the state and local levels as well. In early 2016, for example, the 5 women in the Seattle City Council received death threats after voting together against proposal to build a new sports arena. There are 5 women and 4 men on the Seattle City Council. And Lorena Gonzalez recounted that her personal and private social media accounts and email were flooded with vitriolic messages. And she said, as part of being an elected official, irrespective of your gender, you know you can't make everybody happy. And because you can't make everybody happy, there'll be a certain level of backlash or pushback or disappointment expressed by constituents because of your vote on a particular issue. What was concerning to me about this is that I never came into this position with the expectation that I'd be told to kill myself or that I deserve sexual violence. So for a growing number of women, these types of attacks are leading them to leave politics altogether. Just a few weeks ago, Kia Morris, who is the only Black woman in the Vermont state legislature, decided to leave her position, not just waiting till the next elections, but effective immediately, following sustained threats and harassment. So in this story from the Washington Post, she said that the threats and harassment became a regular part of her and her family's lives, including that of her 7-year-old son. It bled from the internet into their own personal space, the place where they were supposed to feel safest, their home. Once their home was vandalized that fall, once the tree trunks nearby were defaced with swastikas, it was like they couldn't escape it. More recently, as online abuse picked up ahead of her re-election campaign, her family received a death threat, which she said her 7-year-old son saw. And so she said, when I looked at all of this in the aggregate and realized the severity of what we could be facing, she said, I knew I needed to focus on my family and our safety. In another case, last year, Kim Weaver, who was a Democratic and the only Democratic challenger to Congressman Steve King in Iowa, stepped down during her campaign, citing threats to her safety. And she wrote on Facebook that, beginning during my 2016 campaign, I've received very alarming acts of intimidation, including death threats. While some may say enduring threats are just part of running for office, my personal safety has increasingly become a concern. And King's reaction in the tweet below that echoes what often occurs when women report experiences with violence. They're not believed. So he writes, I wanted Kim Weaver in the race, not out. Death threats likely didn't happen, but a fabrication. We thus still have a long way to go in recognizing violence as a threat to democracy and in believing the women who come forward to tell us about it. And this brings me to my final slide, which is about how the Me Too movement has inspired new debates on violence against women in political life, both at the state and national levels. Sexual harassment in legislatures not only affects the current political working environment, but also disturbs the political pipeline in the longer run, when female staff members, who often aspire to later run for office themselves, leave politics as a result of this harassment. As you can see, therefore, there's a lot of work still to be done in our own country to ensure that women can participate in politics fully, freely, and equally. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeleine, and thank you for making this a priority of your work as an academic. It's so important, and we look forward to your new research when it comes out. I'd now like to welcome my friend and colleague, Geoff Hughes, who is NDI's Director for Security and Operations. Geoff spent 18 years in law enforcement in Australia, where he's from, and additionally has worked in 27 countries around the world. He moved to NDI in 2015, 3 years ago, as our Director of Global Security and Operations. And he has always had a particular eye on the importance of women's security globally. A great deal of our workforce and many others who are in the international development space are women. And this has been a priority of his for a long time. He's worked very closely with Sandra and the NDI team on the safety planning tool and the Women's Political Participation Risk Index, helping to bridge the security, the real-life security knowledge that he has, and the gender worlds. Geoff will now introduce the Women's Political Participation Risk Index to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shari. Good evening, and thank you for allowing me to be here. I feel quite privileged. Sandra asked me when I was introducing myself to explain what my come to Jesus moment was. So as Shari mentioned, I've been in the security industry in different forms for about 30 years. First as in law enforcement in Australia, and then in a number of other formats around the world. In November 2017, Sandra asked me would I participate in a round table, which was stage one in determining how would we construct the Think 10 assessment and how we would develop a Women's Political Participation Risk Index. And having a background in security and having some background in the formulation of risk management frameworks, I jumped at the chance. And probably half an hour into the presentation, I think by way of background, I can tell you from my experience what it's like to be shot at in Iraq. I can tell you what it's like to be stabbed in the outback in Australia. I can tell you what it's like to climb Ayers Rock with Benjamin Netanyahu. 30 minutes into my November participation in our first round table, I realised how much I did not know about gender-based security. Fortunately, I did have something to contribute. So my experience, I don't know what it's like. I've never experienced it. To have to formulate a security plan just to leave the house at night to go for a run. I don't know what it's like to be institutionally marginalised from participation at a workplace. I don't know what it's like to have to be harassed on the internet and have my family threatened. And I certainly have no experience of being one of the barriers to my participation in any kind of public forum to be the trade of sexual favours. So my participation in this has been twofold. One, it's certainly been more of a learning experience than it has a contributory one. But I did find a place where my experience could contribute. So it's my great pleasure to be actually asked to explain sort of how we created the risk index. I have to say that along the way I've learnt far more than I've contributed. It's been a very valuable experience. So how do we conceptualise Think 10? So NDI's theory of change for women's participation is it has to address barriers at three different levels. It has to be individual, it has to be institutional, and it has to be socio-cultural. And we needed to measure each woman's risk in the context of their own environment. So a woman looking to enter a political arena, even as something as a school council, right up to the level of where a woman would want to enter the political arena in government politics. How do we address a woman's particular context in the range, the range of political context from A to B? So, in order to achieve a gendered and locally contextualised risk index, the Women's Political Participation Risk Index had to be the measure of three elements. The level of a woman's participation, and that's where is she entering politics? What is the particular nature of her entry into politics? Is it simply as a voter or is it something different? The state of the democracy in their country. And when we talked about the state of democracy in different countries, we piloted an initial democratic categorisation that we invented of different countries. It was rated 1 to 6. And when we piloted it in our first forum, just trying to determine what the state of democracy in the United States was, caused a significant amount of debate. then the likelihood of violence or insecurity that all women face, regardless of whether they're participating in politics or not in that particular country. And the question was, where would we find data on these particular variables? Well, as it turns out, they do exist. So we looked at 3 different factors. Firstly, the actual nature of security. Now, measure the perception of community safety, the lifetime intimate partner violence statistics, and then forms of organised violence. Our sources, the Gallup poll, World Poll of 2016, the UN Women Global Database on Violence Against Women, and the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, the UCDP Geoconferenced event. We looked at the health of democracy in each country, the electoral process and pluralism, civil liberties, the functioning of a government, and general political culture. And we used the Democracy Index of 2017, the Economist Intelligence Unit. And then political empowerment. What percentage of women are in Parliament? What percentage of women are in ministerial positions in each country? How many female heads of government have there been till the date we started? And again, our sources, the Interparliamentary Union of Women in Politics in 2017, the Interparliamentary Union of Women in Politics, the NDI and NDI's internal calculations. Now, each of those things exists. They exist in different formats. The political participation, the index is generally a ratio of the number of women versus the number of men in politics. The health of democracy, the index was expressed on a scale of 1 to 100. The security risk in many countries was expressed on a scale of 1 to 10. So what we did, and credit here must go to Tanisha Rayamaji. Tanisha was our intern from the Madeleine K. Albright Foundation. She interned with us for a short time. She's a Wellesley scholar. And she helped develop the index by reducing each of those 3 different components, the political participation, health of democracy, and the security risk indexes, down to a scale of 0 to 1. And what we got when we created it. So with each of the scales now, each of the 3 components of the index, now on a scale of 0 to 1, for each country on the index, and there's 172 countries on the index. We looked at if we were to add all of the metrics together and then divide them by the number of metrics, we would get an arithmetic mean. And on the left, the arithmetic mean of the rankings of all the countries appears. Then we looked at the geometric mean, and the geometric mean is the nth root of the product of all the countries, the nth root being the number of countries that are there. And what we found that when we used the geometric mean was that of the 3 components of the democracy, a country could not artificially increase or decrease its ranking in the index with one particular factor. So in creating the index, and the index continually updates itself as the different components of the index are updated, a country's ranking relative to its peers won't change just because they have substantially changed one particular component. There has to be manifest significant change one way or the other to realise an increase or a decrease in the ranking of the country. So what we have now, we have the Think 10 self-assessment. A woman interested in political participation takes a self-assessment. The range of possible scores in the self-assessment, depending on her particular involvement in the community, is from 13 to 173. What does that, and then we have an index ranking of 172 countries. Now, how do those 2 components go together to create a level of risk that you can provide a safety plan for and act on? So we considered 3 things in the process to be true. Firstly, that it was possible to be at a moderate, elevated or severe level of risk in any country in the index. So, for example, Norway is on the index, it's at the bottom. It's the least risky country. By contrast, North Korea is the most risky country. We reasoned that a woman's individual political circumstances in Norway, depending on who she is and what level of political engagement she's involved in, she may well score higher on the scale and be at an extreme level of risk even in Norway. Conversely, a woman's particular entry into politics in North Korea might be such that she scores low on the self-assessment. We considered that there is a probability of higher self-assessment scores in the higher risk countries. The self-assessment score had to be meaningful in each country, in each country context. So you can't just take one score and multiply it by the other. You could look at the actual political risk index, numbered 0.1 to 0.999, and simply divide it into thirds. Okay, from the bottom third is low, middle third is medium, top third is severe. But then you don't need the self-assessment. You can look at the self-assessment scores, and you can say from 13 to 53 is low, from 53 to 108 is moderate, from 109 to 173 is severe. But then you don't need the contextual relationship to the index. So the self-assessment has to have context in the relation of the index. So what did we do? We looked at, oh, sorry, excuse me. We need to go back one step. No, because this hasn't been put up. I'll show you the index. So this is the actual risk index that we created. So while I'm scrolling through this, you can look at interesting countries. And you can see the index is constructed with each country in relationship to each other, and it goes from 1 to 0.999. We did it out to 4 decimal places because that gives every single country on the index an individual score. When you reduce it down to 3 decimal places, you get 37 countries have the same score. When you reduce it further, you get 130 have the same score. So by creating the index, we now had a way of contextualising every single country against a woman's self-assessment score. Okay. So we developed a way of determining the level of risk that is a function of the self-assessment score in each country. We looked at the probability of the median range of scores in each country, and we knew, I think, we knew inherently that you would have to score very highly in a country like Norway or Iceland to be at a severe level of risk. By comparison, you would have to score a substantially lower overall score in, for example, Iraq or North Korea to transition from a moderate level of risk to an extreme level of risk. It certainly looks like a bell curve when we understand it, but how to display that? So we developed a way of determining the level of risk, a function of the assessment score, and it's a complicated equation, but this is what it looks like in the end. And if you look at 13 to 173, 160 possible scores by 172 countries. There is something like 29,552 individual cells in the table that let you know exactly how many scores are possible. And we developed an algorithm that helped us determine at what point in each of the countries a person's political participation would move from a safety plan returning a value of moderate level of risk to an elevated level of risk to a severe level of risk. And we went back and we tested this against some of the piloting that we did and found that it was quite accurate. Now in this, I must admit, my experience in risk management frameworks fundamentally knew what we were looking at without a way of being able to express it mathematically or visually. And for this I have to thank a friend of mine named Bill Lukey. Bill works for the National Institute of Science and Research, and he's a Cornell graduate, and he helped us do the underlying math for it. So I've put up 2 screenshots. The first one shows the 172 countries on the left-hand side. I had to compress this right down to give you the visual, and where the index transitions from an elevated level of risk to a severe level of risk. And the next slide, how it transitions from a moderate level of risk to an elevated level of risk. So what we can do now, we have two distinctly, man, that's sensitive. We have two distinctly unique products. We have a way for a woman looking to engage in politics can take a self-assessment, answer a series of questions based on those three metrics, and make an accurate determination of what her risk is against what is a continually updating index of the political risk in her country. So when people take the self-assessment, whether you take it electronically or otherwise, you can look at your score evaluated against the context of the country that you're in, and you will get an outputted safety plan. And I don't want to, for those of you that are physicians or engineers or mathematicians in the audience, I don't want to abuse your profession any longer than I already have. So I'll probably stop there. And I think the next thing we're going to do is open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Geoff. The safety planning tool will be available in 4 languages, Arabic, English, French, and Spanish. It will also be available in 4 versions: paper, for those who need it, online, an app, and also an SMS version eventually. Were we able to do the audience tests? Okay, so I think some people in the audience at least tried out the questionnaire. Sorry. Well, since most of you obviously are from the US and clearly very vanilla, you're all moderate. But as Geoff tried to explain, obviously in the US there are people whose political activism would put them at a higher level of risk. And just because you're in the US is sort of 2/3 down from the top, isn't it?
It's 133 or 140.
Yeah, so if North Korea is number 1 and Norway's number 172, the United States ranks at 132? 132 on the list. So it's pretty safe in general terms as the country, giving it a risk index. But yes, so we didn't get a lot of calibration here, depending on who you are. But we know, for example, I don't know here. No, let me not say it. But in some parts of the world, if you're a member of the indigenous community, you're going to score a lot higher. If you are trans or bisexual or a single parent, if you are a member of a religious minority in some places, you're going to score a lot higher. I see. Well, we shouldn't disclose the initials, but one of our colleagues from Bulgaria, Tamara, you're that vanilla too. It's so. But we can talk more about this. And we'd be very happy now to take questions and answers. And I think Geoff and Mona are still around, so please feel free to ask anything. We can talk about more countries in the risk index if you'd like, but let's come out of this. There are microphones kind of circulating around, so please.
Hi. Hi, I'm Rebecca Turkington. I'm the Assistant Director of the Women in Foreign Policy Program at Council on Foreign Relations, also an alumna of the NDI Gender Team. So great job, guys. This is awesome. I have a question for Dr. Krook. You mentioned in your slideshow, you had the Bolivia law up, and you mentioned that Latin America is sort of on the cutting edge of this. Can you talk about the status of legislation? What's the institutional buy-in on this issue? And if there hasn't been much, sort of, what would you suggest as best practices for legislating this issue?
That's a great question. So in 2012, Bolivia became the first country in the world to criminalize what they call political violence and harassment against women. And since then, legislation has been introduced in 7 other Latin American countries. The furthest it's gotten along the legislative process is in Mexico, where bills have either passed the Senate and then not manage to pass the Chamber of Deputies before the next election, and then passes the Chamber, but not the Senate in the next elections. And so what ended up happening in the case of Mexico, in addition to legislation, I think is a good example of best practice. You had the Federal Electoral Tribunal, the National Institute for Women, the Special Prosecutor on Electoral Crimes, as well as a Special Office on Violence Against Women, came together to create an interinstitutional protocol to identify and tackle violence against women in politics. So within their existing capacities to be able to take complaints, respond to them, and help people who've targeted with political violence. So it's really the part of the world where the conversation's been a little bit more developed. And because of this, we've even seen the Inter-American Commission for Women develop a model law for, based on consultations with women, female politicians across the region, on things that would be needed to sort of fill the legislative void on this issue. So, I think both of those would be emerging best practices for dealing with this issue.
Good evening. My name is Kathy Henderson, and I want to thank everyone for this really stimulating conversation this evening. This is really empowering. I'm a local elected advisory neighborhood commissioner. I've been in the position for 20 years. I'm actually a candidate for the Ward 5 City Council, and when I'm sitting here, I'm having just a range of emotions. My car's been set on fire. I've been attacked relentlessly on social media. I don't have a Twitter account because someone used my name and photo to set up one, and the message from Twitter is that it's been shut down for inappropriate content. Local listservs are used to just really attack me with such venom and force that it's really shocking, such that I've had to reevaluate what my position is. And my core values have not changed. My position is very simple: safety, empowerment, decent, clean, safe streets in my community. A very simple message that resonates with people, except for those who insist upon attacking me. My question is, in addition to showing up every day and continuing to insist that my voice be heard, what would you suggest that I do to address this matter? Because, again, when you look at it in the context of an algorithm, means, and figures, again, I'm experiencing a range of emotions, and this is a global problem, but this is the nation's capital, and I just have difficulty associating my experience in the nation's capital, the beacon of democracy for the free world, with the struggles of women worldwide. And it's just really a sad commentary. But what would you suggest that I do in addition to everything that I've been doing? And thank you so much.
Is it on? It is on. Were you fortunate enough to take our self-assessment to start with? Not yet. I would like you to take the self-assessment. I would be interested to hear what your experience is to start with. One of the things I will say about the United States is that the level of available support here exceeds what is available in other countries. So certainly, sorry, I can't see. Certainly, if you are experiencing those things, you are certainly doing a lot of the right things. I would be following, the simple outlines of our safety plan. I would be looking at your online profile and taking measures to protect your online profile that you may not already be doing. Sandra mentioned in brief the idea of having a trusted contact, and I don't know whether many of you understood, in depth, why we would advocate somebody having a trusted contact. If you are posting on social media from a device, or if you're posting from Facebook, or if you're posting from Twitter, many of those companies, if something does actually happen to you, or you're out of contact for a period, or we can't, your whereabouts are unknown, a lot of those companies won't actually give people access to those services in order to look at your history and look at who might be making those threats. Absent, not being able to get in contact with you. Having a trusted contact that understands your passwords and your credentials to get into those things in an emergency is very, very valuable. I would look at talking to support services like law enforcement, like legal. There are services available here that can actually help you deal with some of those things. One of the things that we are doing as a byproduct of this particular initiative is working initially with security companies, but also working hopefully in the future with law enforcement to try and educate them on the unique challenges that people in your position face, and doing more to stop the actual harassment. The harassment online does exist in a very, very grey area at the moment in most countries of the world. I would certainly not suggest that you stop what you are doing, particularly if you are being effective and you are determined to have your political voice heard and make significant change. I'm not sure what else to explain after that.
I just want to say thank you for your service, because it's and for opening about your experiences, because as I've been doing research over the last few years, I've spoken to women in Canada and Sweden, and they talk about how this is a challenge that they face in terms of their political participation, right? It's not just in the countries where we might expect, like Afghanistan, right? Women face threats as candidates, and I think this is so important, right, to highlight that this is a democracy question, a women's rights question, a human rights question, right? It's hugely important.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you for your work. My name is Stephanie Schmidt, and I'm the U.S. Foreign Policy Counsel with the Center for Reproductive Rights. And before that, I was a U.S. diplomat working with female politicians in Brazil and Haiti on just these issues. So thank you for developing this index. I wish it was around a decade ago. And my question for you is about quotas. And I'm curious, when you were doing the index, evaluating the ratio of female to male politicians, how much of a difference it made in countries where it's mandatory that women make up a certain percentage of the legislature, and how much of a difference that makes in this environment. I'd imagine when there are so many women to target, that the violence is at least more diffuse and less targeted, but I wonder if your research bears that out.
I'm not the expert on that. I'll take a stab at answering your question. No, you will? Okay.
No, I'll give it to Madeleine, because
Okay,
she's...
sure. She couldn't hear the question.
Yeah, she's asking whether where you've got more women in power, you've got a more diffuse issue of violence, or whether it's actually a more kind of acute one. So you can answer one way and I'll answer the other.
Okay, sorry. My hearing's not that great, so it's so important to speak up. Sorry. So what is very interesting is that today we see more women in politics than ever before, right? It's in just the last 2 decades, we've seen a doubling the number of women in elected political positions, and in some countries that's a factor of 3, 4, 5, 6 times as many before. But I still think that the issue of this increase has a couple of different points of bearing on this current trend, because on the one hand, we're seeing efforts to promote women into elected positions, right? So it's something that is challenging the status quo, and that's inspiring a reaction against women's political participation. But if we go back historically, women who've tried to engage in politics have often found this resistance. And in fact, if we go back to the first women who ran for office, they faced death threats and other types of problems. So I think that it's a kind of thing that we see regardless, right? It's really about the fact of a woman trying to participate in politics than it is necessarily about how many there actually are. But of course, there are more women. There are more opportunities to attack them.
In the context of the construction of the index, the thing I mentioned before is very, very important. We did look at the ratio of women in Parliament in different countries, and it obviously does vary significantly from country to country. One of the reasons we used a geometric mean in the construction of the index, so that, for example, if there is a legislated need for a higher percentage of women in Parliament, but other factors in the country are equally significant in preventing women's political participation. We didn't want the legislative nature of just having a lot of women in Parliament, but perhaps not having a voice, to artificially skew where that country falls on the index. And the same with the socio-economic and the economic circumstances. For example, if a country at the higher end of the index was to simply legislatively increase the number of women that are in their parliament, we didn't want that to artificially lower where the country sat on the index. So we used a geometric mean so that, as I said, a country would have to make significant changes in all three of those areas in order to realise significant gains in the health of their democracy and their position on the index.
Hi, I'm over here. What's happening? Okay, I'm going, sorry. My name is Raquel Dominguez, and my question is about what happens to the women who do get into elected positions. And specifically, does the harassment, or in the aggregate, does the harassment and the violence both on and offline, does that decrease once they have, I guess, a quote, a legitimate form of power, or does it decrease? So over time, I assume there's not a lot of longitudinal studies of elected women officials throughout the world, but from what you have seen in your respective professions, do you see that violence sort of tapers off once women have, again, a more supposedly legitimate claim to power, or does it get worse? What are your findings?
Well, as you said, this is a very new topic, right? So we don't have that much overtime data, which, I mean, shows how it's such a new field that there are a lot of research questions to ask. But I think maybe the best way to answer your question is to talk about the experience of Diane Abbott, who is the first Black female member of the British Parliament. And she's spoken to the issue of changes over time. So she was first elected to Parliament in 1987, and she's faced lots of sexism and racism, unfortunately, throughout her whole political career. But she argues that it's actually getting worse, even though this is like part of her landscape. But for her, the changing factor has been the introduction of social media and the ability of an extra platform out there for people to hurl abuse at you. And there's a number of reasons why, because of course that person, people now have a way to access you in a very immediate, anonymous, sort of disinhibited way. But it's also possible when you think about it, the abuse comes to your phone, right? It comes to your mailbox, right? And these types of places that weren't really, there was a separation between work and home. And so I think that there has almost been more of a saturation view from her perspective. But it's really hard to know if that's illustrative of everybody's experience. But I think that as someone who's spoken to the long-term effects, she doesn't seem to think that it's gone. It's gone away, but it's become more challenging over time.
Here, we can pass this one down.
Okay. So this one's working. I don't need to continue to push a button, although I've been told I can push buttons. Thank you. My name is Rachel Carrillo. I once upon a time worked in researching and analyzing and making policy prescriptions for how tech nexus could help fight in situations of violence like human trafficking. That's not my current work, but I'm curious because I try to stay a little bit up to date on what's happening with safe tech and safety tools for women. I myself have been in many situations where I'm not safe, and I've had to either rely on tech tools or just kind of go old school. But in this case, there's a really cool app that used to exist called Be Safe, and it had some similar like safety protocols to what your the Think 10 has, at least in suggestions. So I'm wondering, is there any type of either recommendation or even interface or integration with some type of alert system that could alert your trusted contact or could alert law enforcement if you're in an unsafe situation? There was a woman, for example, who was in a human trafficking situation in the Middle East who used an app functions somewhat similar to Be Safe, and was able to be identified through triangulation and the GPS. So I know that's not necessarily the function of Think 10, but I'm just wondering if there's any kind of integration at all. It would be helpful, I think, in the U.S.
I'll answer your question in two parts. Firstly, the methods for tracking of people and personnel, yes, there are a number of platforms, and they operate in different ways. I think the thing that you're talking about with Be Safe still exists. There are a number of different platforms. There's any number of them available through the app stores from Apple and Google that you can use that are free. They use the SMS system, and they can use, as long as your phone is connected to the internet here, whether it's wireless or whether it's through the telephone network, yes, they can be used to alert people. NDI itself uses a personnel tracking system that I have that tracks all our travellers 24/7 wherever they are in the world through a company called Track24. So yes, the actual services you're talking about do exist. Whether there's any integration with what we're doing, strictly speaking with the Think 10 safety plan, there is not, and that because we're not in the business of risk mitigation. We're a non-profit organisation. What we are doing is that we are trying to encourage the people that develop those apps, and certainly the security companies that manage the large volumes of travellers overseas for organisations and individuals, to use some of the tools that we've got in conjunction with their apps for people that want to use them to make the process better. So yes, those things do exist. That we don't have it, and we don't have any plans to integrate what we're doing with those particular services. But we are encouraging other people to develop them for themselves.
Thanks. We are running up against time because we have some refreshments we'd like to share with you. Unless anybody's got a really, really burning question. No? Okay, then I will thank you all for being here and hope that you enjoy the evening.